Good day, listeners. You're welcome to our first episode of our public enlightenment podcast Speak Up on your darling UWS hybrid station. Here we discuss mental health and other related issues. I'm your host, Rita Aka. Today, I will be discussing the challenges associated with loneliness among students. With me is a PhD student, Miss Lane, whose research interest is currently on mental health. Good to have you here, Miss Lane.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to talk about this.
Yeah, finally we are meeting. Finally, finally the interview is coming up. So, to kickstart, what is the meaning of loneliness to you?
Well, there's two ways of approaching the meaning of loneliness in my research. So one is looking at the official definitions, or the ones that people tend to use, which is from 1982. It's been used by most people, and it's about a discrepancy between an individual's desires and their achieved level of social relations. It's a subjective experience, and what's important is that it's an unpleasant experience. It's usually described as having two forms of loneliness. One is social loneliness, so the absence of social connection and a feeling of social isolation. And one is emotional loneliness, so that's when the relationships that you do have don't feel meaningful and they don't make you feel recognized and seen, or a sense of belonging. And there's also a third type of loneliness, which is about existential loneliness. So it's a kind of a wider feeling about disconnection from others and to the world in general. For me, loneliness, I look at loneliness as an everyday experience. So how does loneliness feel? When you get up, when you walk down the street, in just those little moments of your life, how does that change? What can make you feel lonely? What can make you feel less lonely? What moments accumulate? So maybe having a tipping point where that loneliness just sets in and you just feel lonely for longer periods from day to day. See it as being entwined, how you are, your relationship to the world, your sense of safety and stigma and belonging. So it's a kind of a wider sense. It's how if you feel lonely, you tend to retreat from the world. Your world becomes smaller in terms of geography, in terms of where you go and who you speak to, and your connections to the wider world, to just the little things, like that sense of feeling about connected to the weather, the seasons, to nature. At the moment, if you're not out in the world, you can miss spring flowers and the sun. So that's, for me, that's what I'm interested in loneliness and that sense of connection.
So initially we got the idea of you being an international student wrong. So now the follow-up question is, you've had contacts with other international students, and from your own opinion and then observation, how would you describe their sort of loneliness experience in Scotland? Based on personal interaction with them, how would you describe to us their loneliness?
I think loneliness is complex. So it's complex it has many dimensions. It feels very different for different people. And then I think particularly with international students, with a cultural dimension of loneliness, so where you come from, in terms of your country, in terms of your culture, can also make the experience of loneliness very different from people. So there's a sense of loneliness in your contact with with your family, with your support network. And then there's that sense of cultural loneliness with language barriers in the world not feeling familiar to you, with cultural expectations that you're not entirely sure how to behave in certain situations. That can be within the university, the educational system might be very different from what you're used to, and just being out in the world and all the little things that people who've lived here kind of know, but you might not be able to pick up. And particularly with, all students face issues with loneliness from that feeling of that connection to the wider community, because of how long that you're here, and like if you're juggling things like your studies and your work to have that time to make connections, but particularly I guess for international students, this becomes a particular bigger issue, especially if you've got like financial issues and things like that, in order to know how to connect to that wider community.
Yeah, okay. So now that also brings us to another thing. Now loneliness could lead to so many things. So my next question has to be, what are the challenges associated with loneliness among international students? Because I know probably you've come in contact with some international students. So what would you say are the challenges associated with loneliness among international students?
I think it's a combination, between my observations and my conversations,
Yes.
and I've read about loneliness, is one of the things to combat loneliness is your own strategies.
Mm-hmm.
What people do to distract themselves when they're lonely. So, like for international students, like the tools, the ways that you have to restrict loneliness can be much more restricted than the average student. So, for example, people use maybe going for a walk, or maybe you would just pop down to the local museum because they have a lovely quiet space where you can just sit and watch the world go by. But these things might not be available to international students. You might not know where to go for a walk. Like for me, growing up in an immigrant family, the idea of going for a walk, the idea of maybe following signposts, I didn't know that this was a thing that people did. It never really occurred to me, like going for a walk seems so simple, but it's not actually simple if you don't know about things like signposts or trails, or even, not knowing that maybe museums are free or libraries are free, and those are places that you can just pop in and just sit and relax and just feel part of the world and people. So it's all these cultural details that are challenging for international students. So you have less tools, less ways of distracting yourself from loneliness. So your main way of tackling loneliness normally is to retreat into your room and watch things on your laptop that are familiar, which kind of heightens your disconnect from the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay. So finally, what advice do you have for international students who might currently be in this situation?
I think, as we keep talking about, like, loneliness is so personal and so subjective, and it means different things to different people, and the barrier is different. From my background in like volunteering, providing advice, I actually find that sometimes providing advice can make you feel more lonely, because you may suggest things that people already tried and it doesn't work for them, and the fact that you're suggesting them can make them feel a bit like, a bit of a failure, which is obviously not something I want people to feel. So I guess what I would say is, instead of saying advice, is that it's okay to be lonely, that you shouldn't feel ashamed of being lonely, that lonely is a part of normal everyday life. And yes, it's painful, and yes, it's a hard feeling to have, to be able to try and accept it in order to be able to make it part of you, so that you can be more comfortable with it, so that you can speak to other people and find out that other people also have this experience, but try to resist from letting it to define you. That you should feel, I think with loneliness, you can feel like much of a sense of shame and failure, the fact that you're feeling this and you're incapable of making these connections and friends. So I would say just try not to feel like that, because it's something a lot of people share.
Thank you so much, Miss Lynn, for joining us for the interview. It has been an interesting discussion with you today. It is obvious that a lot of international students experience loneliness, and I hope our listeners might have learned one or two lessons from our discussion today. Please don't be shy. Speak up. If you're an international student and have this kind of feeling, the UWS counseling team is there for you to speak with. You can reach them on 0800 838587. I'm taking it again. 0800 838587. And then you can also send them an email on hab@uws.ac.uk. There are so many associations on UW campus. Don't forget to follow up the Speak Up Team campaign on all social media platforms. Once again, I want to say a big thank you to you, Miss Lynn, for being here for today's episode. Till next time on our Speak Up episode, I remain your host, Rita Aka. Bye for now.